And he wasn't taking the piss either. At assembly one morning, the headmaster, in the sombre voice he kept for expulsions and catastrophic sporting defeats, announced that he was the bearer of grievous news, namely that Robson of the Science Sixth had passed away during the weekend. Over a susurrus of awed mutterings, he told us that Robson had been cut down in the flower of youth, that his demise was a loss to the whole school, and that we would all be symbolically present at the funeral. Everything, in fact, except what we wanted to know, how and why, and if it turned out to be murder, by whom. Eros and Thanatos, Adrian commented before the day's first lesson. Thanatos wins again. Robson wasn't exactly Eros and Thanatos material, Alex told him. Colin and I nodded agreement. We knew because he'd been in our class for a couple of years, a steady, unimaginative boy, gravely uninterested in the arts, who had trundled along without offending anyone. Now he had offended us by making a name for himself with an early death. The flower of youth indeed. The Robson we had known was vegetable matter. There was no mention of disease, a bicycling accident, or a gas explosion, and a few days later Rumour, a.k.a. Brown of the Maths Sixth, supplied what the authorities couldn't or wouldn't. Robson had got his girlfriend pregnant, hanged himself in the attic, and not been found for 2 days. I'd never have thought he knew how to hang himself. He was in the Science Sixth. But you need a special sort of slip knot. That's only in films and proper executions. You can do it with an ordinary knot, just takes longer to suffocate you. What do we think his girlfriend's like? We considered the options known to us: prim virgin, now ex-virgin, tarty shop girl, experienced older woman, VD-riddled whore. We discussed this until Adrian redirected our interests. Camus said that suicide was the only true philosophical question. Apart from ethics and politics and aesthetics and the nature of reality and all the other stuff, there was an edge to Alex's riposte. The only true one, the fundamental one, on which all others depend. After a long analysis of Robson's suicide, we concluded that it could only be considered philosophical in an arithmetical sense of the term. He, being about to cause an increase of 1 in the human population, had decided it was his ethical duty to keep the planet's numbers constant. But in all other respects we judged that Robson had let us and serious thinking down. His action had been unphilosophical, self-indulgent, and inartistic. In other words, wrong. As for his suicide note, which according to Rumour, Brown again read, "Sorry, Mum," we felt that it had missed a powerful educative opportunity. Perhaps we wouldn't have been so hard on Robson if it hadn't been for one central unshiftable fact. Robson was our age, he was in our terms unexceptional, and yet he had not only conspired to find a girlfriend, but also, incontestably, to have had sex with her. Fucking bastard! Why him and not us? Why had none of us even had the experience of failing to get a girlfriend? At least the humiliation of that would have added to our general wisdom, given us something to negatively boast about. Actually, Pustula Burke with the charisma of a plimsoll were her exact words. We knew from our reading of great literature that love involved suffering, and would happily have got in some practice at suffering, if there was an implicit, perhaps even logical promise that love might be on its way. This was another of our fears, that life wouldn't turn out to be like literature. Look at our parents, were they the stuff of literature? At best they might aspire to the condition of onlookers and bystanders, part of a social backdrop against which real, true, important things could happen. Like what? The things literature was all about: love, sex, morality, friendship, happiness, suffering, betrayal, adultery, good and evil, heroes and villains, guilt and innocence, ambition, power, justice, revolution, war, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, the individual against society, success and failure, murder, suicide, death, God, and barn owls. Of course, there were other sorts of literature, theoretical, self-referential, lachrymosely autobiographical, but they were just dry wanks. Real literature was about psychological, emotional, and social truth, as demonstrated by the actions and reflections of its protagonists. The novel was about character developed over time. That's what Phil Dixon had told us anyway. And the only person, apart from Robson, whose life so far contained anything remotely novel-worthy, was Adrian. Why did your mum leave your dad? I'm not sure. Did your mum have another bloke? Was your father a cuckold? Did your dad have a mistress? I don't know. They said I'd understand when I was older. That's what they always promise. How about explaining it now? That's what I say. Except that I never had said this. And our house, as far as I could tell, contained no mysteries, to my shame and disappointment. Maybe your mum has a young lover. How would I know? We never meet there. She always comes up to London. This was hopeless. In a novel, Adrian wouldn't just have accepted things as they were put to him. What was the point of having a situation worthy of fiction if the protagonist didn't behave as he would have done in a book? Adrian should have gone snooping or saved up his pocket money and employed a private detective. Perhaps all four of us should have gone off on a quest to discover the truth. Or would that have been less like literature and too much like a kid's story? In our final history lesson of the year, old Joe Hunt, who had guided his lethargic pupils through Tudors and Stuarts, Victorians and Edwardians, the rise of empire and its subsequent decline, invited us to look back over all those centuries and attempt to draw conclusions. We could start, perhaps, with the seemingly simple question, what is history? Any thoughts, Webster? History is the lives of the victors, I replied a little too quickly. Yes, I was rather afraid you'd say that. Well, as long as you remember that it's also the self-delusions of the defeated. Simpson. Colin was more prepared than me. History is a raw onion sandwich, sir. For what reason? It just repeats, sir. It burps. We've seen it again and again this year. Same old story, same old oscillation between tyranny and rebellion, war and peace, prosperity and impoverishment. Rather a lot for a sandwich to contain, wouldn't you say? We laughed far more than was required, with an end-of-term hysteria. Finn. History is that certainty produced at the point where the imperfections of memory meet the inadequacies of documentation. Is it indeed? Where did you find that? Lagrange, sir. Patrick Lagrange, he's French. So one might have guessed. Would you care to give us an example? Robson's suicide, sir. There was a perceptible intake of breath and some reckless head-turning. But Hunt, like the other masters, allowed Adrian special status. When the rest of us tried provocation, it was dismissed as puerile cynicism, something else we would grow out of. Adrian's provocations were somehow welcomed as awkward searchings after truth. What has that to do with the matter? It's a historical event, sir, if a minor one, but recent, so it ought to be easily understood as history. We know that he's dead. We know that he had a girlfriend. We know that she's pregnant, or was. What else do we have? A single piece of documentation, a suicide note reading, "Sorry, Mum," at least according to Brown. Does that note still exist? Was it destroyed? Did Robson have any other motives or reasons beyond the obvious ones? What was his state of mind? Can we be sure the child was his? We can't know, sir, not even this soon afterwards. So how might anyone write Robson's story in 50 years' time, when his parents are dead and his girlfriend has disappeared and doesn't want to remember him anyway? You see the problem, sir? We all looked at Hunt, wondering if Adrian had pushed it too far this time. That single word, pregnant, seemed to hover like chalk dust. And as for the audacious suggestion of alternative paternity, of Robson, the schoolboy cuckold, after a while the master replied, "I see the problem, Finn, but I think you underestimate history. and for that matter historians. Let us assume for the sake of argument that poor Robson were to prove of historical interest. Historians have always been faced with a lack of direct evidence for things. That's what they're used to. And don't forget that in the present case there would have been an inquest and therefore a coroner's report. Robson may well have kept a diary or written letters, made phone calls whose contents are remembered. His parents would have replied to the letters of condolence they received. And 50 years from now, given the current life expectancy, quite a few of his schoolfellows would still be available for interview. The problem might be less daunting than you imagine. But nothing can make up for the absence of Robson's testimony, sir. In one way, no. But equally, historians need to treat a participant's own explanation of events with a certain skepticism. It's often the statement made with an eye to the future that is the most suspect. If you say so, sir. And mental states may often be inferred from actions. The tyrant rarely sends a handwritten note requesting the elimination of an enemy. If you say so, sir. Well, I do. Was this their exact exchange? Almost certainly not. Still, it is my best memory of their exchange.